My name is Mara Sutton. I'm 32 years old. The letter was 4 pages, single-spaced. On the official letterhead of Dr. Gwen Hartley, licensed clinical psychologist, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. It had a case number at the top and a date at the bottom, and a signature in blue ink that I had watched Dr. Hartley sign with both hands pressed flat on her desk, the way she pressed her hands on things when she wanted to be deliberate. I had been in her office twice a week for 3 years. I had told her everything, the whole architecture of what my family had built, and what it had cost me, and the specific reasons I had made the decision I made at 29, to stop returning phone calls and Christmas cards, and the particular kind of love that required me to be someone I wasn't in order to receive it. The letter Dr. Hartley wrote described none of what my parents had told people. It described no breakdown. It described no instability, no episode, no hospitalization, no crisis. What it described, in the measured, clinical, permanently recorded language of a licensed professional who had been listening carefully for 3 years, was a woman who had made a considered, therapeutic, and emotionally healthy decision to discontinue contact with family members whose behavioral patterns had been documented across years of sessions as psychologically harmful. It described the specific patterns. It named them. It said, in the language that cannot be misread or revised, the decision to cut contact was not a symptom. It was the treatment. I did not cry when I read it. I had been in therapy long enough to know that the things that make you cry are usually the things you already knew but hadn't seen confirmed in writing. What I felt when I read it was something older and quieter, the specific relief of a person who has been called unstable for 3 years by the people who caused the instability, and who is now holding 4 pages that say otherwise. What I did not know yet, when I first read that letter in Dr. Hartley's office on a Tuesday in March, was that the letter was going to do more than correct a personal record. It was going to correct a financial one, and that the 2 corrections together were going to arrive at my parents' door before the month was out. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story genuinely connects with you. Drop your city and the time in the comments right now. I always want to know where you're watching from. Now, let me take you back to Durham, North Carolina, and the Sunday evening I was 29 years old and made the decision that my parents spent the next 3 years trying to explain away. My father, Phil Sutton, was a commercial insurance broker. My mother, Loretta, was a real estate agent. They were well regarded in the specific way of people who work in social professions and have spent decades investing in their reputation. Known at church, active in the neighborhood association, the kind of family that showed up to things and was seen at things and kept the surface of everything polished to a shine that made it difficult, from the outside, to see the structure underneath. I had spent 29 years looking at the structure underneath. I knew what it was made of. My sister Vanessa was 4 years older. She had made her peace with the family's structure in the way that firstborn children sometimes do, by becoming the primary enforcer of it. She managed the family's public narrative with the same energy my mother did, but with an added layer of proprietary investment. The narrative was partly about her too, and she had as much stake in its maintenance as anyone. Vanessa was a dental hygienist in Cary with a husband named Brian and 2 children my parents adored, and a position in the family architecture that required my compliance to remain intact. When I was contributing to the family narrative, present at events, available for calls, absorbing what needed to be absorbed, Vanessa's position was comfortable. When I stopped, it became untenable. This is important to understand. My cutting contact was not just a personal decision to my family, it was a structural problem. It required an explanation that the structure could survive. They chose breakdown. Let me tell you what actually happened. Not the breakdown that didn't happen, but the 3 years before it that made the Sunday evening decision inevitable. My parents had been managing a piece of family property since my grandmother, on my father's side, passed 7 years ago. A small rental property in Durham, a duplex on Hillsborough Road, that my grandmother had owned outright and left equally to her 3 children, my father Phil, my uncle Dale Sutton, and my aunt Patricia Sutton Graves. The property generated approximately $2,200 per month in rental income. My father was designated the property manager, his idea, his proposition, agreed to by Dale and Patricia because Phil was local, and they weren't, and because Phil was, to all appearances, the responsible one. I became involved in the property accounting because my father asked me to help at 26, after his previous bookkeeper retired. I was working as an HR manager at a mid-sized company in Durham. I have a degree in business administration and had taken several accounting courses. And my father said, "It's just tracking income and expenses. You know how to do this. It'll take you 2 hours a month, please." I said yes. I was 26 and it was my father, and 2 hours a month seemed like a reasonable thing to give. Within 4 months, I had found 3 things that required my attention. The first, my father had been deducting a monthly management fee of $450 from the rental income before distributing the split to Dale and Patricia. There was no signed management agreement that authorized this fee. The co-owners had not been informed. $450 a month for 5 years since my grandmother's death was $27,000 in management fees extracted from the shared property income without the other co-owners' knowledge or consent. The second, a repair expense of $14,800 in year 3 had been paid from the property account to a contractor. The contractor was a company called Southridge Home Services. Southridge Home Services was registered in North Carolina to a man named Kevin Pruitt. Kevin Pruitt was my brother-in-law Brian's cousin. The repair had been assessed at $6,200 by a second contractor I obtained a quote from after I noticed the discrepancy. The $8,600 difference had gone somewhere between the property account and Kevin Pruitt, and my father had signed every document in the transaction. The third, the property itself, the duplex on Hillsborough Road, had been appraised at $387,000 by a certified appraiser in year 4. My father had, in year 5, entered into preliminary conversations with a developer about a potential sale without informing Dale or Patricia. I found this in an email thread I accessed because my father had asked me to manage the property email account. The developer had offered $340,000. My father had counter-proposed $320,000 and suggested the sale could be structured to close quickly if the other co-owners could be brought to agreement rapidly. Dale and Patricia did not know a sale was being discussed. The appraisal was not shared with them. I took all 3 findings to my father on a Saturday morning. I had a printed summary. 3 pages, specific, dated with supporting documentation attached. I sat across from him at the kitchen table the way I had sat across from him my whole life, and I said, "I need to talk to you about the property accounts." He read the 3 pages, he set them down. He said, "You're making something out of nothing." I said, "I'm making something out of $27,000 in undisclosed management fees, an $8,600 contractor overcharge, and a sale conversation that Dale and Patricia don't know about." He said, "I manage that property. I deserve compensation." I said, "You deserve compensation that was agreed to and disclosed." He said, "Kevin did good work." I said, "Kevin was paid $8,600 more than the same work was worth on the open market." He said, "You don't understand business." I said, "I have a business degree and I've been doing the accounts for 4 months. I understand these accounts specifically." He said, "Don't take this to Dale and Patricia." I said, "I'm not going to be the person who keeps this information from them." He said, "You will destroy this family." I said, "I didn't create the discrepancies, I found them." I took the findings to Uncle Dale and Aunt Patricia within the week. I sent each of them the same 3-page summary with supporting documentation. Dale called me on a Thursday evening. He was 64, retired, living in Asheville, the kind of man who spoke carefully and listened more carefully, and whose response to the documents was 11 minutes of silence, followed by, "I need to get an attorney." Patricia called on a Friday morning and said 4 words. "How long has this been going on?" My father called me that Saturday. He said, "You did this." I said, "I showed 2 people information about their own financial interests that they had a right to have." He said, "You went behind my back." I said, "I went around your instructions to conceal information from your co-owners." "That's different." He said, "You are not welcome in this family if you are going to act like this." I said, "I'm not going to stop acting like this." He hung up. My mother called 40 minutes later and said, "You have broken your father's heart." I said, "I found $27,000 in undisclosed fees and an overcharge and a secret sale discussion." She said, "You are choosing strangers over your own parents." I said, "Dale and Patricia are not strangers. They're co-owners of property my grandmother left to all 3 of her children equally." She said, "This is not who we raised you to be." I said, "This is exactly who you raised me to be. I just applied it in a direction you didn't expect." The calls after that increased in intensity and decreased in good faith. My mother called 6 times in 1 week. My father called twice and said nothing substantive either time. Vanessa called and said, "Why are you doing this to them?" I said, "I'm going to stop responding to that question." She said, "You're being unreasonable." I said, "I'm going to stop responding to that characterization as well." She said, "Reagan." I said, "Mara." She said, "What?" I said, "My name is Mara." Not Reagan, not whatever name you use when you want me to agree with you. She said nothing. The Sunday evening decision came 6 weeks after the Saturday morning conversation with my father. It did not come from rage. It did not come from a breakdown. It came from a conversation with Dr. Gwen Hartley, in which I described the previous 6 weeks, and she said, "Mara, you have been managing your family's discomfort with your honesty for your entire life. What would it feel like to stop managing it?" I sat with that question for 3 days. Then I stopped returning the calls. I want to be precise about what cut contact looked like. I did not send a letter. I did not make a declaration. I did not post anything or tell anyone or set up a formal mechanism. I simply stopped responding. The calls stopped being answered. The texts stopped being replied to. The Christmas card that arrived in December I read and placed in a folder I kept for documentation purposes and did not respond to. I was 29 years old and I had been in therapy for 8 months and I had one appointment with Dr. Hartley every Tuesday and Thursday. And I was, by every metric I had access to, the most mentally clear and emotionally grounded I had ever been in my adult life. My parents told people I had a breakdown. I want to be specific about how I know this and what they said. I know it because of Ivy Colson, my closest friend since college, a speech therapist in Durham who has the particular combination of clinical training and personal loyalty that makes her the right person to have in your corner when a family is trying to revise your history. Ivy received a call from my mother 3 months after I cut contact. My mother told Ivy that I had experienced a significant mental health episode. She used the phrase, a complete breakdown, and had become paranoid and delusional, that I was making false accusations against my family, that I had cut everyone off because I was sick and the family was giving her space to get the help she needs. My mother asked Ivy to let her know if I seemed to be getting better. Ivy said, "Loretta, I talk to Mara twice a week and she's fine." My mother said, "That's what she wants you to think." Ivy called me immediately after the call. She said, "Your mother just told me you had a breakdown." I said, "I know she's saying something like that." Ivy said, "Mara, what do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to know it isn't true." She said, "I know it isn't true. I talk to you twice a week, but I need to know what you want me to do with the information." I said, "Keep it for now. I'll tell you when it matters." She kept it. She told me every time someone called her with the same story. In 3 years, 14 people called Ivy with the breakdown narrative. She logged every call, the date, the caller, the specific language used. She is a speech therapist and a documentation professional, and the best person I have ever known. She kept the log for 3 years without me asking her to. The breakdown narrative went wide. It reached my mother's book club. It reached my father's church community where he was a deacon. It reached my grandmother's generation of friends, elderly women in their 70s and 80s who had known me since I was small and who received the story from my mother with the credulity that comes from deep trust in a long-standing relationship. It reached, through Vanessa, the extended family network of cousins and aunts and uncles who had last seen me at holidays and whose only information about my current state came through Vanessa's filtered account of what had happened. And it reached my Uncle Dale. Uncle Dale received the breakdown narrative from my father directly. A phone call, 4 months after I cut contact, in which my father told his brother that the property dispute had been the product of Mara's deteriorating mental health, that she had become paranoid about the family finances, that she was making accusations that had no basis, that the family was devastated and doing everything they could to get her help. Dale told me all of this, eventually. He told me that my father cried on the phone. He told me that my father said, "She's going to need professional care, Dale. Real care. We're looking into facilities." He said this while simultaneously, as I would discover, asking Dale for money to cover the cost, $40,000. That was the number. My father called Dale in November of the first year of my no contact and said the family needed $40,000 to help cover Mara's treatment costs. A residential program, he said. Very specialized. Insurance wouldn't cover all of it. The family was doing what they needed to do. Could Dale help? Dale, who loved me, who had been close to me for my entire life, who had no reason to disbelieve the brother who had just wept on the phone about his daughter's breakdown. Dale transferred $40,000 to my father's personal account within the week. I was not in a residential program. I was in my apartment in Durham, going to work every day as a senior HR manager, attending twice-weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Hartley, having dinner with Ivy on Thursday evenings, and building a life that was, for the first time since, I was old enough to know what the word meant, genuinely mine. I did not know about the $40,000 for 2 years. Let me tell you how I found out. Dale called me in October of year 2. He had tried my number once a month for 18 months. Short calls, no voicemail, just a ring. I had not answered because I did not know which narrative he was calling from, and I did not have the energy to find out. But the October call came on a Sunday at 7 p.m., the time he had always called when I was in college, the time he had used before everything changed, and I answered. He said, "Mara, I need to ask you something directly." I said, "Okay." He said, "Are you in a treatment facility?" I said, "No. I'm in my apartment. I've been in my apartment for 2 years." He said, "I gave your father $40,000. I said, "I know nothing about that." He said it was for your care." I said, "I have never been in residential care. I have never been hospitalized. I attend outpatient therapy twice a week with Dr. Gwen Hartley at her practice in Chapel Hill. I am functioning at full capacity. I have been promoted at work twice in the last 18 months. The silence that followed was the silence of a man reorganizing his understanding of the previous 2 years. He said, "He told me you were in a facility." I said, "I am not and never have been." Another silence. Then, "Mara, I need you to be honest with me about something else." I said, "Yes." He said, "Did you actually find what you said you found in the property accounts?" I said, "Yes. I have all of it documented, $27,000 in undisclosed management fees, an $8,600 contractor overcharge, a preliminary sale discussion that you and Patricia were not informed of." He said, "I've had an attorney reviewing the accounts since you sent the documents. His findings confirmed yours." I said, "I know." He said, "Your father told me it was paranoid delusion." I said, "My attorney's findings agreed with your attorney's findings. Numbers don't have delusions." Uncle Dale. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I want to fix this." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "I don't know yet. But I want you to know that I am going to find out where my $40,000 went and what it was used for, and I am going to fix whatever is fixable." I said, "I'd appreciate that." He said, "Can I ask you something personal?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you okay? Actually okay?" I said, "I'm the best I've been in my entire adult life." He said, "Good." He paused. "I should have called you sooner." I said, "You called me at 7 on a Sunday." He said, "Your grandmother's time." I said, "I know." He said, "I loved her very much." I said, "So did I." After the call with Dale, I called Dr. Hartley, not at 7 p.m. on a Sunday. I called her office line and left a message asking for an urgent appointment. She called back the next morning and we met that Tuesday. I told her what Dale had told me. I told her about the $40,000. I told her about the 14 calls Ivy had logged. I told her the full scope of the breakdown narrative and the financial extraction that had been run alongside it. Dr. Hartley listened with the focused stillness she brought to everything I said in her office, the quality of a person who is tracking multiple threads simultaneously and waiting for them to organize into something that can be named. When I finished, she said, "Mara, I want to ask you something." I said, "Okay." She said, "Would you be willing to authorize me to write a letter? Not a general letter of support, a clinical document, addressed to the specific people who need to see it, that describes accurately what I have observed and documented across 3 years of your treatment." I said, "What would it say?" She said, "It would say that you have never experienced a breakdown, that you have never been hospitalized or in residential care, that your decision to cut contact was therapeutically discussed, processed as a concerned family member who told the HR administrator that I had a history of mental instability and had recently experienced a breakdown, and that my employer should be aware. My HR director, a woman named Shelley Park who had hired me and who knew me well enough to recognize the call for what it was, told me about it the same afternoon she received it. She said, "Mara, someone called and told us you had a breakdown." I said, "I know that's being said." She said, "Is it true?" I said, "No." She said, "I know it's not, but I need to be able to document that I investigated." I said, "I'll get you documentation." Shelley was the one who first suggested I consider a letter from my therapist. She was also, it turned out, the one who suggested the ethics inquiry line. Not because she thought anything would come of it formally, but because she said, "If this ever comes up again in any professional context, you want the correction on record somewhere that has institutional standing." She was right. The state bar angle is relevant for a different reason. My father, as a commercial insurance broker, was regulated by the North Carolina Department of Insurance. He was not a member of the state bar. But the property dispute had involved him in conduct, the undisclosed management fees, the contractor overcharge that his attorney, when Dale's attorney formally raised the matter, had advised could expose him to civil liability, and potentially to a complaint with the DOI if it rose to the level of fraudulent misrepresentation. This was the institutional context that made the letter's mention of financial extraction using a false mental health narrative relevant beyond the personal. The complaint was not my doing. It was the natural consequence of the documented facts meeting the relevant professional standard. Let me tell you what the letter said, because it is the center of this story and it deserves to be told precisely. Dr. Hartley's letter opened with her credentials and the duration of my treatment. It stated clearly, Mara Sutton has not experienced a psychiatric breakdown. She has not been hospitalized or enrolled in any residential treatment program. The characterization of her mental state as unstable, delusional, or in crisis is clinically inconsistent with her presentation across 3 years of documented treatment. It continued, Ms. Sutton's decision to discontinue contact with her immediate family was discussed extensively in therapy over a period of 8 months prior to the decision being made. The decision was not impulsive, reactive, or symptomatic. It was a considered response to behavioral patterns documented across years of sessions that I am authorized to describe in general clinical terms as chronic emotional invalidation, coercive control through financial manipulation, and the systematic dismissal of her perceptions and experiences when those perceptions conflicted with the family's preferred narrative. The decision to discontinue contact was therapeutically recommended and clinically supported. Then the part that my parents had not anticipated. It has been reported to me by my patient, and I have documented in my clinical notes, that following her decision to discontinue contact, a narrative was constructed and distributed by members of her family of origin that attributed her withdrawal to a mental health crisis. My patient has described in session the financial implications of this narrative. Specifically, the use of this false characterization to solicit $40,000 from a family member under the stated purpose of covering treatment costs for a crisis that did not exist. I am not in a position to make legal determinations. I am in a position to state that the distribution of false mental health information for financial gain is itself a behavioral pattern consistent with what my patient sought treatment to address. The record is clear and documented. It closed. Mara Sutton is mentally well. She is functioning at a high level, professionally and personally. Her treatment goals have been substantially met. The narrative being circulated about her mental state is false, and I am prepared to provide clinical testimony to that effect in any relevant proceeding. 4 pages. Blue ink signature. Case number at the top. Let me tell you what happened in the 6 weeks after the letter was sent. Dale received his copy on a Thursday. He called me that evening at 7 p.m. He said, I read the letter. I said, I know. He said, I sent it to my attorney this afternoon. I said, okay. He said, he's filing a civil fraud claim against your father by end of week. I said, I know that's your decision and I support it. He said, it's $40,000, Mara. He took $40,000 from me for treatment you never received. I said, I know. He said, he used you as the instrument of it. He used his story about you to take money from someone who loved you. He said it carefully, the way he said things when the weight of them was visible in his voice. I'm sorry I believed him. I said, he's been convincing people of things his whole life. That's not your fault. He said, I should have called you first. I said, yes. He said, I won't make that mistake again. I said, I know. Patricia called on a Saturday, and Patricia, who had been waiting for a reason to act on the property matter since Dale's attorney confirmed my findings 18 months earlier, and who had been, in her attorney's assessment, building a very organized civil case that was now significantly strengthened by a clinical document that established the behavioral context for the financial misconduct. She said, your therapist writes a good letter. I said, she writes an accurate one. She said, same thing in this case. She paused. We're filing on the property matter next week. Jointly, Dale and I. I said, I know. She said, your documentation was the foundation of all of it. I said, I'm a business administrator. I keep records. She said, you're your grandmother's granddaughter. I said, I've been told that. Shelley Park received the letter copy at work on a Friday morning and walked to my office with it in her hand and closed the door and said, this is one of the most professionally clean documents I have ever seen. I said, Dr. Hartley is thorough. She said, the call we received has been logged and the documentation added to your personnel file as a formal response. Anyone who calls again will be read from this letter. I said, thank you, Shelley. She said, Mara, for the record, I never believed the call for a single minute. I said, I know. She said, I just needed the paper. I said, everyone needs the paper. My father received a civil complaint from Dale's attorney on a Tuesday. He received a separate civil complaint from Patricia's attorney on a Thursday of the same week. He received a letter from his own attorney the following Monday advising him that the conduct described in the complaints, combined with the clinical documentation in Dr. Hartley's letter, created significant legal exposure that needed to be addressed urgently and honestly. I know the sequence of these events because Dale's attorney provided me updates as a material witness to the property accounting findings. I did not gloat about the sequence. I filed it in the folder I kept for documentation purposes and went to my Tuesday therapy session and reported that I was feeling something I was struggling to name. Dr. Hartley said, "What does it feel like?" I said, "Like 29 years of being called the unstable one by people who were themselves doing unstable things has finally arrived at a ledger that agrees with my version." She said, "That's called accountability. It often feels strange from the outside." I said, "Strange is the right word." She said, "It's also called justice." I said, "Yes, I suppose it is." Vanessa called me 3 weeks after the complaints were filed. Her voice had the quality it got when she had been sitting with something for a long time and had finally decided to say it before it calcified into something permanent. She said, "I need to tell you something." I said, "Okay." She said, "I knew about the $40,000. I let the silence sit." She said, "Dad told me when he called Dale, he told me what he was going to say." I said, "And you didn't call me?" She said, "No." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because calling you would have meant doing what you did, choosing accuracy over peace. And I didn't have the courage for that." She said it specifically and without excuse, and it was the most honest thing Vanessa had ever said to me in 32 years of being her sister. "I've been calling you the unstable one in my head for 3 years," she said, "because if you were unstable, then what I did, not calling, not warning you, not standing up, was okay. It was managing a sick family member. If you weren't unstable, then I just abandoned my sister to protect my own comfort." I said, "Yes." She said, "I abandoned you." I said, "Yes," she cried, "the real kind, not managed, not performed." I let her. I had been in therapy for 3 years, and I knew the difference between tears that wanted something and tears that were just the sound of a true thing arriving too late and still arriving. I said, "I'm not ready to have dinner yet." She said, "I know." I said, "But I'm not closing the door." She said, "Okay." I said, "Vanessa." She said, "Yeah." I said, "Brian's cousin overcharged the property account by $8,600. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know." I said, "Did you know at the time?" She said, "Brian mentioned Kevin had gotten a contract from Dad. I didn't ask details." I said, "Okay." She said, "Is that in the complaints?" I said, "It's in the documentation." She said, "Okay." She said, "Reagan." I said, "Mara." She said, "Right, Mara. I'm sorry." My father called me 6 weeks after the complaints were filed. I answered. He said, "The attorneys are talking." I said, "I know." He said, "I need to tell you something without attorneys." I said, "Okay." He said, "I made up a story about you because it was easier than admitting what I had done." He said it flatly, not crying, not begging, the flat voice of a man who has been advised by his attorney to make whatever personal amends are available before the legal process determines the institutional ones. I understood that context, and I accepted the apology anyway, because the context of a thing doesn't always determine its sincerity, and my father sounded, underneath the flatness, like a man who had arrived somewhere true. He said, "I told people you were sick because your findings made me look like what I am. I used your name and your mental health to get $40,000 from my brother. And then I used the same story to dismiss your findings so nobody would look at the accounts." He said, "You were never sick, you were right, and I punished you for being right by calling you sick." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are." He said, "Is there?" He stopped. "Is there a way back from this?" I said, "I don't know yet. The legal process has to run. What comes out of that will determine what the relationship can look like." He said, "That's fair." I said, "It's the only answer I have right now." He said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." My mother called 2 days later. She had the voice of a woman who has been sitting in the consequences of something and has decided that she is going to account for her specific part of it rather than the general category of it. She said, "I started the story. I said, "What?" She said, "The breakdown story. Your father took it further, but I started it. The first person I told was my book club." I said, "Mara is having a hard time, she's not well." I said it because I was embarrassed that you had cut contact and I needed a reason that didn't make us look like the problem. She said, "I needed the story to be about you so it wouldn't be about us." I said, "I know." She said, "I spread it to 11 women before your father used it with Dale." I said, "I know." Ivy logged the calls. A pause. "She kept a log?" I said, "She's a documentation professional. She kept a log." My mother was quiet for a long time. Then, "I would like to start over, not from 32 years ago, from today." I said, "Starting over isn't available. Starting from what's true is." She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means we don't pretend the previous 3 years didn't happen. We account for them, and we decide whether there's anything worth building on top of the accounting." She said, "Is there?" I said, "I don't know yet. Show me. The showing will tell me more than the asking." She said, "Okay." I said, "Mom." She said, "Yes?" I said, "I was never unstable. I was inconvenient." She said, "I know that now." I said, "I need you to say it to the 11 women in your book club." She was quiet. I said, "Not for me. For the record." She said, "Okay, I will." I said, "Good. Let me tell you where everyone is now." The civil matter between Dale, Patricia, and my father settled 4 months after the complaints were filed. The terms are confidential. What I can tell you is that the property on Hillsborough Road is now managed by a professional property management company with full transparency to all 3 co-owners, that the management fee discrepancy was addressed as part of the settlement, and that the $40,000 was returned to Dale with interest. I was not a party to the settlement. I was a material witness whose documentation formed part of the evidentiary record. I received no money from the settlement. What I received was a letter from Dale's attorney confirming that my original findings were validated in full. I printed it and put it in the documentation folder. It is the last thing in the folder. The folder is closed. Dale and I have coffee every other Sunday. He drives from Asheville to Durham, 2 hours each way, and we sit in the same diner on Broad Street that I have been going to for 4 years, and we talk for 2 hours about his garden and my cases at work, and the property and the family and whatever is true that week. He never mentions the $40,000 except once. On the 4th Sunday, when he said, "You know what bothers me most?" I said, "What?" He said, "Not the money. The 2 years I spent believing you were sick when you were fine. The 2 years your father gave me a false version of you." I said, "I know." He said, "I missed 2 years of you." I said, "You're here now." He said, "I know." He said, "I'm going to be here every other Sunday until I can't drive anymore." I said, "I'll have the coffee on." Ivy and I had dinner the week after the letter was sent. I told her about the letter and what it had set in motion. She put her log on the table. A spiral notebook, 14 entries, dates and colors and language used. 3 years of parallel documentation. She said, "Do you want this?" I said, "I want to know what to do with it." She said, "I think you keep it the way you keep all of it, in a folder, labeled clearly, closed." I said, "Not for any proceeding?" She said, "The proceeding is over, the record is straight, the log is just proof that someone was watching when it mattered." I said, "Thank you for watching." She said, "You would have done the same." I said, "I know." She put the notebook in my bag. I still have it. Dr. Hartley and I have 1 session per week now, down from 2. The work is different. Less excavation, more construction. We are building something rather than clearing something, which is what therapy eventually becomes when the clearing is done. She told me 3 months ago, "You are not the same person who came into this office 3 years ago." I said, "No." She said, "What's different?" I said, "I don't spend energy managing other people's versions of me anymore." She said, "What do you spend it on?" I said, "My own version." She said, "Good." She pressed her hands flat on the desk the way she did when something was true and needed to be marked. "That's good, Mara. Not dinner, coffee." I was not ready for dinner, and I said so, and she came to coffee without making it a negotiation. We talked for 90 minutes. She said Brian's cousin has been removed from the family's contractor list, which was a thing she said as a statement of fact rather than an expectation of credit. I noted it. I said, "That's right." We talked about her children, my niece and nephew who I had not seen in 3 years. She said, "They've been asking about you." I said, "What have you told them?" She said, that you needed some time and that you love them and that you'll be back when you're ready. I said, that's accurate. She said, I've been trying to be accurate. I said, I can see that. I have not seen my niece and nephew yet. I am getting there, slowly. On my own timeline, which is the only timeline I am willing to use, my parents and I have not met. The legal process ran. The settlements were made. My father sent a letter, handwritten, 2 pages, which I read twice, and placed in a separate folder I labeled differently from the documentation folder. I have not responded. I am not ready. The door is not locked. I have decided it swings from my side, and I will open it when I am ready and not before. Here is what I want to say before I go. There is a specific weapon available to families that is more dangerous than most people understand: the mental health narrative. The story that says, she is not well, she is unstable, she is paranoid, she is having a breakdown. It is dangerous because it is impossible to disprove from the inside. The harder you push back, the more it looks like confirmation. The more calmly you behave, the more people say, she's medicated, she seems okay right now. It is a sealed room, and the family that builds it around you controls the only key. What breaks the seal is documentation. Not emotion, documentation. A clinical letter on official letterhead with a case number and a blue ink signature from a licensed professional who has been listening carefully for 3 years and has notes that cannot be revised. A log kept by a friend who documented 14 calls across 3 years with dates and callers and specific language. A 3-page property accounting summary with supporting documents that 2 independent attorneys confirmed was accurate. A personnel file note at a company whose HR director logged the call and attached the clinical response. Documents do not have breakdowns. Documents do not get paranoid. Documents do not become unstable under pressure. They just say what they say, in the same words every time someone reads them. That is their power. That is why the people who want to revise the record hate them. If your family is using your mental health, real or invented, to explain behavior that is actually theirs, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to have a record. You are allowed to have a therapist who writes letters. You are allowed to have a friend who logs the calls. You are allowed to document the discrepancies in the accounts and send them to the people who have a right to see them. You are allowed to be well and to prove it. You are allowed to say, I am not the unstable one. The instability is in the accounts. Let me show you the math. The breakdown they described was never mine. It was the story they needed to tell so they could live with what they had done. The story fell apart on 4 pages of clinical documentation that said, she was always well. She was always right. She just stopped pretending otherwise. That is not a breakdown. That is the opposite of one. My name is Mara Sutton. I'm 32 years old. I'm an HR manager in Durham, North Carolina. My parents spent 3 years telling everyone I had a breakdown. My therapist's letter said something entirely different. 4 pages, blue ink, case number at the top. The record is straight. It has always been straight. I just needed the right document to prove it. Thank you for staying until the very end. If someone has ever used your mental health, real or imagined, to explain away something that was actually theirs, drop a comment. Tell me what they said about you and what the truth was. I read every single one. Share this with the person in your life who has been called unstable for being accurate. They need to know the letter can be written. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.